Okay, thanks everyone for tuning in, especially Gopi at this early hour. I'm excited to talk to you guys about the research that I've been doing on endemic African storks, as Clay already kind of gave you some background on. Okay, so storks as a group of birds are notoriously understudied, especially in Africa. For most species, talking about especially these ones in Africa, empirical population estimates don't really exist. And so consequently, the IUCN status assessments are really just guesstimates more than science. And these 6 species that are here are the 6 endemic species that are found year-round in Africa. There are 2 other species of storks that occur in Africa, the white and the black stork, but they are Palearctic migrants, and I didn't do any of my research on them. They're probably some of the best studied storks in the world, actually. But just want to introduce you to these 6 species that I'll be talking about. So the Abdim stork is largely and feeds mostly on insects and small animals. And then the remaining storks up here are largely reliant on aquatic habitats, although there hasn't really been any research that's addressed further details other than that they occur in different types of wetlands. The African Woollyneck, Saddlebill Stork, Yellow-billed Stork, and Marabou Stork all feed on aquatic prey like fish and also small terrestrial animals. And then the Openbill is a mollusk specialist, and so mussels and snails make up most of their diet. But beyond basic life history, we don't really know much about the ecology of these species or the status, the real conservation status of these species. But all 6 of them are listed as least concern on the IUCN Red List, despite there being no actual data for reliable population estimates. So to address some of the most rudimentary knowledge gaps about the African storks, I asked these questions for my thesis research. The first one, where do they occur, seems pretty basic, but it's pretty important because one of the criteria used by the IUCN and BirdLife International to determine status are some range metrics. And so an accurate estimate of this is important for being able to assess status. However, for species that occur in non-uniformly distributed habitats, like wetlands where these aquatic storks occur, range size criteria can misrepresent conservation status because wetlands aren't evenly distributed on a landscape. And so that's kind of an issue. And for the African storks that I'm talking about, and this is by no means unique to them, the widely used IUCN and BirdLife range maps haven't actually been developed using repeatable methods or reliable methods, and frankly, don't even know anything about data that was involved in making those maps. So besides just a lack of empirical population estimates, inaccurate distributions have implications for how these species are going to be assessed as far as their status, conservation status goes. And then after looking at where they occur, a reasonable next question is, why do they occur there? What environmental factors are influencing their distribution? So to begin, I just want to familiarize you with the environments of Africa, because a lot of what I'll be talking about will have a spatial component, and I'll be showing lots of maps. And I think having a general idea of the continent will be helpful when I'm talking about where these species occur. So this is a map of land cover in Africa. Here, this orange and pinkish is agriculture. And so you can see that agriculture is most widespread in West Africa, where there's also a mix of savanna and different types of forests. And then up here in the yellow is the Sahara Desert. And this belt along the Sahara is dry shrubland, which is a region known as the Sahel. And I'll be referring to the Sahel a lot, and so that's why I just wanted to point that out. Then here in Central Africa, the landscape is dominated by forest and wooded savannas. And then from east to Southern Africa, there's sort of a diversity of savannas, grasslands, shrublands, and some woodlands. And then in the Horn of Africa and the extreme southwest, it's mostly arid shrublands and also desert. And rainfall here is highest near the equator. And then as you increase in latitude, there's sort of a gradient in precipitation. And precipitation across the continent is largely influenced by the intertropical convergence zone, which moves across the equator from north to south and creates highly seasonal rainfall. And so when it's the wet season in the north, it's the dry season in the south, and then the convergence zone moves to the south, and then that kind of swaps. Very basic and generalized, obviously, there's a lot more going on there. And then given that 5 of the species that I'll be talking about are largely dependent on wetlands, I just wanted to show a map of the distribution of wetlands across the continent. Here, this map is showing different types of wetlands, but really the take home is that wetlands and waterways, major rivers, are widespread across Africa, but they're not really evenly distributed. And so, for example, you have these big wetlands in certain areas, and then smaller wetlands in East Africa and the Great Rift Lakes Valley. And so this is just to give you an idea of how wetlands are distributed. So to answer my first question, I mapped distribution of each species, and my objectives for each species were to collate all known records, which there are a lot of, tens of thousands for each species, and then use these records to develop a map that has historic and recent occurrence. And then using historic and recent occurrence, assess how much range loss there has been over time, and then compare the maps that I created to the IUCN bird life distribution maps to see how well they represent real distribution. So I used a huge variety of sources for records because I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. And I think I have after a couple of years of collating data. Citizen science databases were probably the biggest contributor of records. So eBird was a big one, GBIF, SABAP 1 and 2, West African Bird Database, and observation.org. All of those combined made up the bulk of the records. And then I also used 15 country-specific bird atlases, which have been published over the past 35 years. And these are basically efforts to map distribution at a national level. But some of these are, like I said, decades old. And so using those for a historic basis was important, and then using newer data like from citizen science databases to add to that. I used a huge variety of literature spanning over 100 years from every kind of journal and publication you can think of, old books, and extracted locations from those when locations were described. And then finally, I used personal communication from in-country experts, which was especially critical in marginal areas of the range or areas that aren't visited very frequently, like conflict zones. And then for each species, I mapped the records at a resolution of 0.5 degree by 0.5 degree. So the maps are cells that are this size, cells that are occupied, or there's at least one record in each cell. And then I divided these occurrence maps into two periods to look at range loss, potential range loss, and I'll explain that in a moment. And the two periods that I defined were the historic period as everything before 1990, and then the recent period in the past 30 years. And the reason I say potential range loss is because, as I said, some of these countries have a lot of conflict, and so they're poorly visited. And so coverage isn't very good in some countries, and it may just be that no one has been there doing surveys or birding recently. And so we can't say that there has been range loss here, but there potentially has been. And you'll see that in some of the countries in the maps. And then after developing those maps, I just qualitatively compared them to the distribution maps from the IUCN and BirdLife. So there's a lot going on here. I know this is a busy slide, but I think it's really helpful to see each species, the product of each species range map side by side, so you can see some similarities and differences. And just to kind of orient you to what's going on, each species has their little picture or whatever, but there's also this percentage associated with each map, and that is the potential percentage of range loss across the entire range. And the way that I calculated that was dividing the number of cells unique to the historic period by the total number of occupied cells across the whole range in both time periods. Note that the gray in the back of the map is the IUCN BirdLife range. And also note that it kind of overrepresents or misrepresents rather range for most species in West Africa. For the African Woollyneck, it's probably the most accurate, but the others, it really misrepresents range. And so you can see the hollow boxes are the historic occurrence. And so you can see that Somalia, if you're not familiar with African geography, this is Somalia over here. Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan here have more historic records than recent, so there's not a lot of red there. Red is the recent records, and that's because of conflict. Like I said, all three of these countries have experienced civil war for decades, and so there hasn't been a lot of birding visitation or surveys, and so we really don't know what's going on there. We don't know if they still occur there. And the same is true for the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is here. There are more recent records or more historic records than recent. And it's possible that this is also due to poor coverage because of conflict, but just not as certain about that because there is more visitation here than other countries. And so this is kind of a question mark on what's going on there. And all species had the most limited ranges in West Africa, and that's where distribution is fairly fragmented for most species, except the Abdim stork. And I just want to talk about a few noteworthy things for each species based on my literature reviews, reviewing all these records, and then the potential range loss estimates. So for the Openbill, it's curiously the only species that isn't found on the West Coast, like in Senegal, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. The only one of the wetland species, the Abdim stork, isn't found there, but the other wetland species are found there. And so that is kind of curious and not sure why that might be. There are also only 2 known breeding colonies in West Africa. One is in Sierra Leone, the farthest western. It's a isolated population, and this breeding colony was not known until this study. One of my colleagues, Papani Bai Sase in Sierra Leone, told me about it, and it's the only known breeding site there. The only other known breeding site is in coastal Benin, and it's very small. And then the next closest colony that we know of is in Ethiopia. So that is noteworthy. Something that's also noteworthy is that in South Africa, it has colonized, it's expanded its range in the past 30 years, actually really more like in the past 10 years. And so that's something that is worth noting as well. And then along with the yellow-billed stork, the African-billed stork occurs in Madagascar. They're the only two species that occur on Madagascar, but don't know anything about their status there. No known breeding colonies, although they are definitely breeding, we just don't know anything about them there. The Abdim stork is the only confirmed complete migrant, and so it can be found almost anywhere across sub-Saharan Africa. You can see it has the largest range, and that's because it's migrating across the equator twice a year. They are wintering in West Africa and in some parts of East Africa, and then they spend the non-breeding season in East and Southern Africa. And more recently, they've been spending the non-breeding season in Oman here in the Middle East at a few sites, as you can see there. And they've actually increased here since the 1980s. So in the 80s, the maximum group size was 61, and now groups as large as 900 have been observed, and groups of hundreds are common now. The African woollyneck has a very patchy distribution in most countries, especially outside of East and Southern Africa. And so it's kind of hard to discern any clear pattern of range loss other than in the countries I already mentioned, as well as Nigeria, where there's more historic records than recent. But they have also expanded in South Africa, in the far eastern part of the country, similar to the African Openbill. The Saddlebill stork has the most limited range in West Africa of all the species, and there are only a few populations known, and there appears to be little to no connectivity between them. So there's one record of some juveniles in the Inner Niger Delta of Mali here, but that is the only location in the past 30 years that occurs between these two populations in the West. Apparently, it was only ever resident in Nigeria at one game reserve, and there was only ever a few seen there. And the last time it was seen there was in 2015, and there was only one individual. And so it's been assumed that they've disappeared from there. And Nigeria has an ongoing bird atlas, and they have pretty good coverage, and that's the only place they've ever been seen. And that suggests that there's not really any connectivity that we know of between the central population and that in Cameroon and Chad. The marabou has declined significantly in West Africa. Breeding populations there are highly fragmented. So these are the three areas where there are known breeding colonies. There's a few in the Gambia. There's a very small one in northern Benin. And then there's a couple large ones in northern Cameroon. And doesn't appear that there's a lot of connectivity between these areas. There's a few recent records, as you can see, but some of them are over a decade old. But in East and Southern Africa, the marabou is thought to be increasing, and that's mostly because they do very well in human-dominated areas, even living in cities. But still, across their whole breeding range, there's a limited number of breeding colonies, and so that's also noteworthy. For the yellow-billed stork, it had the greatest range loss of all species, but is widespread from East to Southern Africa. And you can see here in the red circles that these are known breeding colonies in the northern part of its range. And there is no known breeding between Senegal and Cameroon anymore. They've mostly been extirpated from West Africa. A few, just like the Marabou, a few of the recent records are over a decade old, but they fall within that 30-year period. So they have done the worst in West Africa. And I haven't shown it here in the map. You can't see the Mediterranean region for the yellow-billed stork, but it is the species that's most prone to vagrancy. And so there are a number of records from the Mediterranean region in both the historic and the recent period, the farthest of which is in Bulgaria, which is very far from where they should be. So just as a summary, these are the trends for all 6 species. So the core of the range for all species was from East to Southern Africa, and the most apparent declines in fragmentation has been in West Africa, where pretty much all but the Abdim stork have highly fragmented ranges. And this includes some near extirpations in countries like Ghana, Togo, Mali, and Nigeria. So these are some of the factors that are thought to have contributed to the decline, particularly in West Africa. These threats have been most prominent in West Africa and have all kind of been compounded. And from 1972 to 1992 in the Sahel region of West Africa, there was a very long-term drought known as the Great Drought. And during this time, a lot of dams were built on major rivers for water storage and electricity. And so that changed the hydrology of areas where these storks forage. And one of the biggest examples of this was in Ghana just before the Great Drought began. Okasambo Dam was built on the Volta River in Ghana, creating Lake Ghana. As you can see here, it's this huge water body, and it's actually the largest man-made lake in the world by surface area. And so it completely altered the flow and flood regimes of the black and white Volta River, and then the Oti River, which went into Togo, and then all of their tributaries. And so that is thought to be one of the reasons why like the yellow-billed stork disappeared from Ghana. Overfishing has really only been thought to be an issue in the Inner Niger Delta of Mali. In the 1960s, nylon fishing nets were introduced, and then that led to a much greater catch by fishermen there. And not that that alone would cause declines, but it was compounded with the drought and many dams being built on rivers there. And so it's sort of the perfect worst storm for water birds. Persecution has been in the form of just destroying nesting colonies, particularly of yellow-billed and marabou stork. Fishermen often perceive them as competitors for fish, and so they just go in and destroy all the nests. And in the 90s, this was a big issue in Cameroon. There was one colony of marabou that had over 500 nests, and all 500 of the nests were destroyed. And so for a species where there's only just a handful of breeding colonies in the region, that was the largest colony. And so that being wiped out has population level consequences for the region. And then poaching of chicks for food is known in the colonial species, the openbill, yellow-bill, and marabou stork. And actually that breeding colony that I was just informed about in Sierra Leone, the only one there, people know about it because they're going there and they're harvesting chicks for food. And this is also an issue in Cameroon and even Botswana, particularly with the openbill, it seems to be. And then an informant has confirmed with me that all of these species, all 6, are sold in the traditional medicine trade in Nigeria. In Nigeria, this trade is very big in Nigeria, and most of the large bird species have either declined significantly or been extirpated in the country because of this kind of poaching for the trade. But in some areas, some species are increasing, and the availability of anthropogenic food is a big reason for this in some areas. The Marabou, African Woollyneck, and Abdim stork are all very successful in urban areas. They can be found in trash and offal dumps. As you can see, this picture in the background is of Marabou storks in Uganda, where they're kind of famous for this, living in the city like Kampala, just eating garbage and even nesting in the city. And this is a common scene there. And the woollyneck does behave similarly by occurring in feeding in dumps, but also in South Africa, where it's expanded its range, it just lives in residential areas because people just put food out for them in their backyard. And so now woolly-necks are even nesting in people's backyards. And then I think that the increase, no one has really addressed the increase of Abdim stork in Oman. But to me, I think that the availability of anthropogenic foods is a good reason why they might be increasing there, because most of the records are from trash dumps there. In Southern Africa, a lot of artificial ponds have been created for water storage or for cattle. And so that's kind of, particularly in dry areas, for that's where ponds have been created. And so this has created patches of habitat where there naturally wouldn't be. And so species like particularly the yellow-billed stork and the Marabou stork are showing up in pretty dry areas where they just naturally wouldn't have occurred before. And then for the Openbill, no one has really addressed their expansion in South Africa. The creation of new water bodies would definitely be one reason that they could have expanded, but I suspect that the expansion of invasive snails might also be playing a role. This definitely needs to be investigated further, but this is exactly what's happening with the Asian Openbill in some countries in Asia, like China and Thailand, where they're expanding very rapidly, and there are known invasive snails in South Africa. And so I think that this might be one of the reasons that they've colonized. So to answer my second question about, okay, now that we know where they occur, why do they occur there? I used environmental niche modeling as a tool to answer that. I did not do this for the Abdim stork because, like I said, it's a complete migrant. And so that migratory pattern requires more complex modeling of breeding versus non-breeding ranges. And so I just focused on the 5 wetland species for the niche modeling. And for each of those species, I sought to predict the distribution of suitable areas across their range, determine how important different environmental variables are in predicting distribution, and to describe responses to environmental variation. And then finally to look at niche overlap among these species. So niche modeling is really just a tool to describe suitability in ecological space. And so it requires both occurrence data and environmental inputs. And when interpreting niche models, it's important to recognize that the model only represents the niche within the environmental dimensions of those inputs that you use. And so for my models, these are the inputs that I use. They're very basic, particularly because there's not a lot of large-scale environmental variable layers available for Africa. But the first set of data that I used was climate data from the World Climate Database. And these are averages and extremes of annual and seasonal temperature and precipitation, as well as elevation. And this data set is from 1970 to 2000. And originally it's 19 variables in the database, but I eliminated strongly correlated variables, and that left me with 9 climate variables as inputs for my models. And then for land cover, I used data from the Globe Cover project, which is satellite-derived vegetation categories from the European Space Agency. And then for occurrence records, I just used the same data that I used to develop distribution maps, except I filtered them down to the time period 1970 to 2000 so that they would match the temporal scale of the climate data. However, the land cover data was from 2009 because that's just the only data that's available. And so that's just kind of a caveat that is not temporally congruent with the other data. And then I built these models in a program called Maxent, which is a machine learning algorithm that outperforms other predictive distribution models. And it has a number of benefits. One of the biggest ones is that it only requires presence data and not absences. And absences are a lot harder to verify than presences. And so that is why Maxent is useful. It uses the area under the curve, or AUC, as a metric to assess predictive capacity. And this is essentially a random, AUC is a measure of the probability that random presence will have a higher predicted suitability than a random absence, or in this case, because we don't have real absence data, a pseudo absence. And AUC ranges from 0 to 1, where as it approaches 1, predictive capacity improves. And so generally, in the literature, an AUC of over 0.75 is considered to be a model with good predictive capacity. I ran 10 replicate models for each species to produce averages because during each model run, the Maxent algorithm can follow slightly different paths and have some slight variation in output. But one of the benefits of Maxent is that during these replicate model runs, completed models are tested against one another for cross-validation. And then Maxent performs jackknife tests as a way to assess variable importance. And essentially this is when models are run without a single variable, and then run with just a single variable, and then the different combinations of that in order to see how that influences the predictive capacity. And then this results in basically a ranking of model variables, so you can see how it contributes to, each variable contributes to predictive capacity. And then finally, I estimated niche overlap using the metric I in a program called E&M Tools. And I is developed from probability theory, and I won't get into the weeds about it, but it's really just used as a measure of overlap between pairwise model predictions. So comparing each species to another in every combination. And it ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 indicates no overlap in model predictions between the two species, and then 1 indicates that they have identical niche overlap. And then I replicated the same process of modeling in Maxent at 4 different scales. So I did the range-wide scale, which is basically sub-Saharan Africa. And then I looked at 3 different regions, East, Southern, and West Africa, just to look at smaller scale variations in their response to environmental variation. So I'm just going to summarize all the models together because they had a lot of commonalities that are important to highlight. So all models, regardless of scale or species, had high predictive capacity, and AUC for all the models ranged from 0.81 to 0.89, which is how I determine that they have high predictive capacity. And basically this means that the models can accurately discriminate between presence and background samples, or pseudo-absent samples. I ranged from 0.89 to 0.99 in all pairwise comparisons between model predictions. And so that means that niche overlap was high at every scale for all species. And in some cases, it was near identical. Because you'll recall that an I of 1 means they have identical niches. Variable importance was scale and species dependent, but these top variables were featured among the most important in all models, some combination, although they had different rankings. They all were important regardless of the model. Annual precipitation and land cover were most frequently the most important models, and then precipitation in the warmest quarter and the coldest quarter and elevation were also important in some models. And then as far as land cover associations, models at all scales generally had similar results, although there definitely was some species dependent and scale dependent nuances, but all models showed strong positive associations with flooded vegetation categories and water bodies, which is not surprising since these are aquatic species. But what was surprising was the association with artificial surfaces, which are urban areas. And this might be an artifact of spatial sampling bias, which I'll talk about shortly. Or it could be that, like I pointed out, the land cover data was from 2009 and the records were from 1970 to 2000. And so perhaps just some of the areas that were urban in 2009 were actually less developed when storks were recorded from 1970 to 2000. And then across the board, the weakest associations were with broadleaf forest types, which are mostly in Central Africa and West Africa, and then a mosaic of forest and grassland, and a variety of cropland categories, except for the African Openbill in West Africa, which actually showed the strongest positive associations for that model. So I'm not going to go over every variable, but I want to highlight just a couple of them, a couple of the modeled responses, and point out some meaningful commonalities and divergences. So these are the species-specific and scale-specific responses to annual precipitation. And these response curves are when all the other variables are held constant at their means. And so you can see that for all species and each scale, they had similar responses to one another and among scale. And there seemed to be this optimum approximately between 500 and 1,000 millimeters of annual precipitation. So that is definitely noteworthy. And then these are the responses to seasonal precipitation at each scale. So for the range-wide model and the East and Southern African model, the variable is precipitation in the warmest quarter. And then for West Africa, this response curve is for precipitation in the driest month. And so note for the range-wide response, the African Openbill diverged from the other species in having a very positive relationship with increasing precipitation. And then in East Africa, it was the opposite. The African Openbill showed an even more negative response to precipitation than the other species. And then in Southern Africa, the differences aren't as great, but the African Woollyneck and the Saddlebill appear to have the strongest negative response to high levels of precipitation. And then in West Africa, the African Openbill diverges again in having a very positive response to precipitation in the driest month, while all the others' probability of occurrence decreases with increasing precipitation. Here are the spatial predictions of suitability. The redder it is, the more suitable the area is based on the models. And I'm only showing the West African and range-wide models here because the East and Southern were very similar to the range-wide spatial predictions. But the greatest differences were in West Africa. So if you just compare this part of West Africa with this range regional model, you can see that the predictions are very different. In the West African model, for the Openbill, there's a lot of suitability here in the middle of the region. And for all the other species, the highest suitability is in the far west. So just wanted to come back to this issue of spatial sampling bias with MaxScent. It is an issue because there is the potential to overestimate suitability or underestimate suitability. So basically what spatial sampling bias is that there's some areas that are being surveyed or covered more than others. And so in this case, East and Southern Africa receive a lot of ornithological coverage compared to West Africa. And so it's possible that that bias could be affecting the outcome of the models. Also, this is just all collated data. And so there's not any sampling design. And so it is not random. And so there could be bias in that. But it could also just be that the lower suitability in West Africa really does represent marginal conditions. So this is the periphery of each species range, and generally at the range edges, species are at the limits of their environmental tolerance. There's greater environmental stochasticity, and they can occur at lower densities or even be less abundant. It's not always the case, but that could also explain just the lower suitability in West Africa. And then I just wanted to touch on the Openbill that had some divergent responses to some of the variables. If you recall, it is a mollusk specialist, and so it's very different from the other species in that sense. So the environmental requirements of the Openbill could actually be limited by where mollusks occur, the environmental requirements of their mollusk prey. I don't claim to know anything about the mollusks that they're feeding on, but it could just be that the mollusks aren't going to be occurring in water bodies where there's such marked seasonal dry down, like the other species where they're occurring and feeding on fish. But this requires a lot more looking into. And then also its positive association with croplands in West Africa is noteworthy because, and this might also be related to their prey. So maybe certain snails do well in crops like rice in West Africa, and the fish that the other species are feeding on don't. But I don't know if this is true or not. But in Asia, Asian Openbill do very well in agricultural areas, as do some of the other stork species. And so they're also feeding on fish in Asia. And so I don't know if prey is really a limiting factor in agricultural areas of West Africa. So this is something that's definitely worth looking into because agricultural landscapes are very, very poorly covered in Africa as far as research goes. And so annual and seasonal precipitation came up as being important in predicting distribution. And this makes sense in the light of what we know about wading bird ecology, but it's not necessarily precipitation itself that is important for wading birds. It's not like they need to be rained on or something. It's really how precipitation influences water levels. So wading birds like storks rely on seasonal drying down of wetlands, and it's during this period that prey are concentrated, and that's normally when breeding occurs. And there is one study that has sort of got at this in the Marabou stork in Eswatini that found that nest success actually declined with increasing rainfall during the nesting period. And this has also been shown in research on wading birds in other parts of the world. The relationship between hydrological dynamics and stork ecology has not really been studied in Africa, maybe besides that one study on Marabou. But there is some anecdotal evidence of similar importance of drying out events like in other parts of the world. So these two images here are from a scene in Ciconia National Park. This was sent to me by a birder, Robert Barnes, a little while back. And these are actually cropped from a huge panoramic image that is so big that when you look at it on your computer, it's just a line. You have to zoom in like 500 times to see this, but it's because there's just hundreds of Marabou storks, hundreds of yellow-billed storks, herons, egrets, pelicans, all these wading birds, and then also the second highest concentration of saddlebills ever recorded. And so it just demonstrates how during the dry season, this was actually this time of year, April, these kind of dry down events are really important for these birds. And they could come from very far to certain wetlands that are drying out. But it's not like this every year. Interannual variation in rainfall has important population level consequences in an area like the Sahel. There is huge variation in rainfall each year. And this hasn't been studied in Africa, but it's been studied in other parts of the world on wading birds. So like Clay said, I'm working in the Everglades now, and there have been decades of research by Peter Frederick and others that have shown how the interannual variation in rainfall and therefore the water levels affects the breeding of wood storks and other wading birds. And so you can imagine in the Sahel, where during the Great Drought, rainfall was at near historic lows, that there was much lower reproduction, if any reproduction at all. And that was kind of compounded with these other threats that were causing population declines. And it just was, like I said, the perfect storm for these species, and is why they've disappeared from a lot of areas. And then, of course, in the future, under certain climate scenarios, the same kind of thing can happen where huge variation in rainfall can have population level effects. Which brings me to the high niche overlap that I found in my models, which suggests that each of these species has similar environmental sensitivities, meaning they're sensitive to different environmental changes rather. And also that niche partitioning isn't necessarily occurring at this scale or with these variables, but it's maybe occurring at smaller habitat scales via interactions with each other, other wading birds, or even through prey selection. But none of this has been studied in Africa. It would be very beneficial to address this to understand the dynamics between these species. So all of these findings are really the first pieces in a puzzle of trying to understand these storks and eventually developing empirical conservation status assessments. So it's clear from my research here that important regional declines, particularly in West Africa, have been overlooked, and that this isn't really represented in any status assessments, especially because there's no actual population data. Field data on demographic responses to environmental variation would be very useful to not only compare to the model predictions here, but to understand how these species will respond to environmental stress like that, which will occur in certain regions under climate change. And then one thing that I'm working on right now is mapping breeding distribution, especially for the Openbill, Marabou Stork, and Yellow-billed Stork, which are the colonial breeders, because as I showed, particularly in West Africa, there's very few breeding colonies. And so knowing where these are and the threats that they face is really important to understand, because like I said, something that happens to a single breeding colony could have regional consequences. And then finally, like Clay said in the beginning, I'm going to be investigating genetic connectivity across the range of these species, which will answer a lot of population level questions, but is especially important for those populations in West Africa that have very poor connectivity. And so there's a lot to learn about these species, and this is just really, even though these models are very basic, they sort of create further questions that can be investigated, hopefully in the field rather than using modeling techniques. So I want to thank a lot of people, especially my committee. Clay, Gopi, and Sarah have been nothing but encouraging and supportive in both my pre-COVID and my post-COVID projects. And I also just want to thank this huge network of people that not only provided unpublished data, provided their own observations, they pointed me to literature I didn't know about. They helped me create this network. They put me in touch with one another. And so I'm really indebted to all these people and more for helping make this project possible. Without them, none of this would have been possible. And so with that, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in, and I can take any questions.
Hey, thanks, Jonah. Yeah, we got time for questions, so I'll open it up. Just feel free to either raise your hand or come off mute.
Yeah, Gopi, did you have a question?
Oh, no, that was applause.
Oh, I just saw the little hand.
Okay, if no one wants to ask a question, I have. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you, Jonah. It's just like, it's an amazing work. I mean, it's just, it seems like these animals, they really need some attention. I'm not an expert of these animals, so hopefully my question or comment doesn't, I mean, it shows that ignorance in this group of animals. But one thing that is just like, was looking at your results is that the range losses were very similar, and at the same time, I mean, this kind of is validated at some point that the niche overlap models, I mean, it seems to me that they might have the same constraints. But for the first part, when you describe the range loss, I'm also thinking that you might want to explore some other possibilities for that first part of your work, using those grains to, I mean, the squares to quantify or to measure the area that they are prone to some problem, to some statistical problems, because depending on the size of the grain that you're using, just like you might get the problems of variance. For example, let's say that you replicate the study, instead of using half a degree, you use 1 degree, you might get another pattern. So we always wonder if that's a real pattern or that's an artifact of the sampling. And then in some, let's say that you make it smaller, so there might be some variation. So one approach might be maybe doing a null model. I mean, there are many ways to approach this, but I just want to make a comment. What's your take on the using of those grain sizes, or just like any other technique that you will potentially help you measure that range constriction? Because as a first approach, it looks fine, but I just want to make your words just like you can discuss the potential pitfalls of that if you might have an artifact in there in that measurement compared to other methods, or how would you avoid that? But overall, I mean, it's an amazing work, the one that you did. I mean, it's just like very thorough.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. The reason that I didn't mention this, but the reason that half degree was the resolution that I chose was because that's what a lot of the country-specific atlases used. And so I couldn't go any smaller than that. I could go bigger, but you might lose some important information by changing that resolution. But it's very true. I hadn't considered looking at differences in the different spatial scales, but I had looked at different temporal scales. So I used 1990 as a cutoff, primarily because I've already published a couple papers with Gopi using some of these distribution maps for the Saddlebill and the African Woollyneck. And we use 1970 as a cutoff. And when you use 1970 as the cutoff between the historic and the recent period, you miss a lot of the range loss that's occurred more recently, because the Great Drought in West Africa was from the 70s to the 90s. It looks like they're still there and they're doing fine. But when you change the cutoff to 1990, it really becomes apparent where they have disappeared from in the last 30 years. But it's a very good point about the different cell resolution, because that could change the conclusions that you come to about range loss.
So, so from what I'm hearing, just like the information in those atlases are just like a constraint to that size. So you were not using data point. I mean, like, for example, the ones that you will get from just like a museum collector, a GPS point, or?
Yeah, it was a combination. So for most of the atlases are like published books. And so they're so old that they don't have like, they were mapping them by hand.
Okay.
And so all I could do was digitize those squares. There's a few that where I did have georeferenced like coordinates, but most of them, it was just digitized from books.
Okay, I see the problem.
Yeah.
I see your limitation of the data. I see, okay, no, that's all. I mean, yes, that's what data is. Because I mean, Sarah was a member of another recent thesis that was not long ago with Jared. So she can share probably that with you later. I mean, that's probably details. That this student, he used actual data points and another method that avoids completely the use of those, and then it avoids the problem of using these different stories. But again, if your data is limited by that, then I mean, that's the route to take. Now, just be prepared when you get some data to publication for the reviewers, you know, kind of be ready for that preemptive.
Yeah.
Just kind of, even when you're writing, just like you described that, so the reviewer say, okay, yeah, that's the limitation of the data.
Yeah.
Perfect. That explains. And you may explore later, but if you have already gathered all this data, maybe start to comment with you later, just like you can read the thesis of Jared, that see the methods that he used. I mean, it might be applicable for species for future. It seems like hope we're gonna continue working on these, and then just grab each species and do those molds, and you start to refine. But overall, it's just like it's an amazing work, and that was my only comment question. So, and good luck in doing the PhD over there in South Africa.
Thank you.
I always encourage. I will actually invite some of my students to tell them, because the students can go to do grad school somewhere else, and we need an expertise in other places of the planet. Congratulations on that, the defense.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Yvonne. Any other questions? There's got to be more.
I'll jump in. I'm going to wait till the committee, the private committee session, but if no one's asking, so so I'm sure in such a broad area, you know, the effects of anthropogenic climate change are have varied, you know, across this region. But where would you think, like management wise, where would you focus if, you know, given X amount of dollars and worked for a nonprofit or whatever it is, or maybe a government agency, or not just one country, but for all of these countries, where would you focus management, and how, and particularly with the future projections of climate change in the region?
West Africa, I talk about West Africa a lot. Because not only because that's where the greatest declines have been, and there's all these threats, but that's also where the issue of climate change is greatest. Of course, it's going to be an issue in some other regions, but there's kind of mixed projections. In West Africa, there's a recent paper from like a year or two ago that is like predicting like imminent change in the entire climate there, because the Great Drought changed a lot. Some think that land use has done a lot. Lots of agriculture and livestock have degraded the shrublands there. And so it's just a lot drier, especially following the Great Drought. And so I would definitely focus on West Africa because it's where they're blinking out, and some of them already have blinked out. There's just been so little attention in West Africa as well. So there may be places that these species occur that we just don't know. But I think one of the biggest management actions that could be taken there is just floodplain restoration. Because of all these dams that have been built. In Cameroon in the 90s, they started doing some of this by taking down some dams and changing the way they were using dams. And it really restored the Char-Lagon River floodplains along the Cameroon-Chad border. And they just saw waterbird populations start to increase again pretty rapidly. And so it was just that simple change. I mean, it wasn't simple, but that's all it took, was just restoring some semblance of the natural flood regime. And in some places that's going to be impossible, like Ghana, where you have that huge dam, you're just going to release all that water or something. But smaller scale changes, there's lots of small dams that aren't necessarily providing hydroelectricity like they were meant to be, particularly in Mali, where none of these species breed anymore. And so I think could be the single most effective action that can be taken for species in that region.
Okay. Thanks.
I had a question that might kind of teeing off what the last person said, was if was the bigger, are you seeing that the bigger problem is the dams, or is it just a combination of the drier periods or the estimated drier periods that might occur as climate warms, or is there some other, like you're going to do the genetics of it, is there some other susceptibility other than just well, I guess water is a big one, right? So, but I mean, is there something else that you're looking at that might also be part of that range loss?
So the issue is just not only like the direct loss of habitat when the river, those river valleys become a giant reservoir, but also just the change in hydrology. So you're not getting the seasonal pulse during the rainy season where huge areas are flooding. And then that's when the dry down is occurring, and that's when they're breeding during that dry down, when prey are becoming concentrated. So really it's just the changes in hydrology that have been the issue. And it just happens to be that a lot of this occurred at the same time as the drought. And then like in Mali, the same time when nylon fishing nets were becoming widespread there. And so it's just like coincidence that all these things happened at the same time. But obviously you're not going to change the drought that happened, it's over. But if you don't try to restore the hydrology, then as the climate changes and another drought like that hits, fortunately right now, rainfall has recovered in the region. And so we'll see what happens. But if another drought hits and you don't have these wetlands anymore, then they're not gonna come back, these species. They're just gonna continue to decline.
Thanks. Great talk, by the way. Really interesting.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I can wait until the part one too, but.
Well, let me say one thing, sir, and then, yeah, the advantage of being in the Zoom world is that nobody is held captive. So I don't want to stop anybody that has questions. Sarah, you, and then anybody else. But of course, if you need to leave, you can obviously quietly leave via Zoom. But I don't want to stop anybody from asking questions. So Sarah, go ahead and see if anybody else.
If anyone else has a question, I'm on the committee, so I have another couple hours with them. So please.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah.
It could be 4. We might be going to midnight here.
We've got to get Gopi up to lunch hour.
True.
I have a quick question. Excellent job, Jonah. It was excellent to see you. I had to wait a little bit because you're kind of on our main TV and the dogs and everything. There was a lot going on here. So
Yeah.
I just wanted, my question was, what is being done about the invasive snail species right now? How is that, what is the, I know you alluded to it, you were talking about a little bit, what is the impact, and do you know if anything is being done about that per se in some of the areas we studied?
I don't, in South Africa, I have no idea like if they're taking any management action. You know, it may be benefiting the Openbill, but I'm sure it's, you know, harming the native mollusks there or other species, but I don't really know much about that, to be honest.
Yeah, so we're not sure if it's, I mean, it happened by, you know, it happened by chance, but we're not sure if it's, how can I put that? It's still affecting negatively others, but it's also helping out the Openbill. So I'm not quite sure where they stand on it, I guess you could.
Yeah, it's not as far as I know.
And my other question was, when you were talking about in Ghana, the man-made lake reservoir, the largest that's in the world in terms of surface area, what have we been seeing in terms of, I know you talked about it a little bit, but in terms of species coming to that area now as a wetland compared to what they would have been using prior that reservoir replaced?
There's definitely like some wading birds that can, you know, use the edges of that lake, but basically the hydrological dynamics that were so important for the waterbirds there it's just gone because it's just a giant lake now. And so there's not that, I mean, of course there are changes in the water level, but prey aren't being concentrated like they would have in the floodplains of the river. And so it's just like a completely different environment now. And even though it's water, it's not the right conditions that they require.
Right. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much. Once again, excellent presentation.
Thanks.
Thanks, Camden. Anybody else before we go to committee? Yvonne?
Yes, one last question. I mean, I'm curious. Obviously, this is not about just your research per se, but it seems like you know just like the situation. I was curious. I mean, these storks, that the ones that are using this trash to eat, has anyone done anything about the ecotoxicology? Because it's probably not good. That it looks like they have a lot of resources in there, but what about just all the stuff that they are eating, pathogens or even heavy metals in their blood or anything like that? Are you aware if anyone is working on that?
Yeah, like literally just weeks ago, a colleague came out with a paper looking at Marabou storks in Botswana, where they're feeding in, they were comparing storks that were feeding like out in the wetlands and natural areas, and then those that were feeding in town at trash dumps. And yeah, there were heavy metals. They were collecting feathers and testing that. And there were heavy metals in their feathers, and I am not recalling all the other details of that research, but yeah, that's just like brand new research that just came out like within the last month, looking at that.
It seems a relevant question, so
yeah,
it seems like you're gonna have a lot of work for the rest of your career.
Hopefully. Job security, study an unstudied species.
Yeah, well, congratulations again. Great talk.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Yvonne. Anybody else? All right, let's congratulate Jonah one more time on a job well done, and then we'll break and go to committee. Thank you all for attending today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.